but it was propagandized. And the idea here was that if unfettered market forces were simply allowed to have their way, if short-term profit maximization for huge multinational corporations would only become our bottom line, if only we would take the functioning of our government and basically of our civilization and gear it towards this organizing principle of making sure that fossil fuel companies and health insurance companies and big pharma and military industrial contractors and every chemical companies, agribusiness, every possible kind of corporate conglomerate that you can imagine. As long as our entire functioning was geared towards advocating for their profits, then this would lift everybody. It would lift all boats. What it actually did was to leave millions and millions of people without even a life vest. And yet this was perpetrated. It began in the 80s, and it wasn't until the 90s that this devastation to the middle class of America began to be so obvious. But it has had more than an economically devastating effect. It has had a socially devastating effect. It has gotten into the sinews of American civilization. It has made us look at each other as though we are transactions rather than relationships. And when you say that making sure that market forces are your false god, because that's basically what it's become. We're all supposed to bow down. Well, that's how it works, that's how it works, that's how it works. No, that's not necessarily how it works. When I was a child, the social contract was such that it was understood that a corporation had a moral responsibility, a corporation had an ethical responsibility to more than just its stockholders. It had an ethical responsibility to all stakeholders. That means the workers, that means the community, that means the environment. But all of a sudden, starting in the 80s, we were all supposed to buy into this notion that the only responsibility of this large corporation was to the short-term economic gain of its stockholders. You know what agribusiness has done here in Iowa, but it's everywhere. We can point to industry after industry after industry, in which some of the work that is the most dignified, some of the work that is most meaningful, some of the bonds that make human life most important, are sacrificed at the altar of this false god. Now, what has happened because of the nefarious influence of money on our government, particularly since the Citizens United decision, is that the government now, for all intents and purposes, has become a system of legalized bribery, called in Janet Mayer's book, Dark Money. So that what has happened is that our government, because remember we talked about the Declaration of Independence, that the government's function, governments are instituted to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Instead, our government functions mainly as an advocate for that short-term profit maximization of these huge corporate conglomerates, as opposed to advocating primarily, first and foremost, for the people of the United States. To the point where, as Abraham Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. It's perishing now, in our generation, because we have become essentially a government of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations, of the few, by the few, and for the few. This is a problem. And our generation has the task, the challenge, to rise to the occasion as other generations have before us, and to drive this peril from our midst. Now, I'm running for president because all of the principles of personal transformation that are encapsulated so beautifully in Tina's lyrics, that love overcomes all that is not love. I have seen how this transforms lives. I have a 35-year career, and I can tell from the responses of many of you in this room, you've read the same kinds of books that I've read and that I've written. Many of us have become very, very aware. And in America today, whether it's religious, spiritual, recovery movement, psychotherapy, we are a good and decent people. It's not like we're not. But too often in America, our drive for goodness, our search for wisdom is kept within the private sphere. meantime is that fear has been harnessed for political purposes. And the only way that we can override that and overcome it is to harness love for political purposes. There are 4 pillars where I see a deep need for a moral and spiritual awakening in this country as it applies to our politics. All that a nation is a group of individuals. So the same psychological and emotional and moral principles that apply to the life of an individual apply to the life of a nation. And what we know, those of us who are interested in transformation, is that you can't ultimately change your life just by changing things on the outside. You've got to get straight with all that is good and true and beautiful, the higher power, the God of your understanding. That is as true of a nation as it is true of people. We should not just ask whether or not we're a rich society. We should ask whether or not we are a good society. If ethics and morals and values and principles of goodness and truth matter in our individual lives, then those things should also matter in our public lives. And we as citizens are the holders of that responsibility to make it so. There are 4 issues I want to discuss with you tonight. Number 1, if an individual has no conscience, if an individual has no remorse, if an individual has no sense of ethical responsibility to deal with other people with compassion, that person is called a sociopath. An economic system which feels no sense of remorse or compassion or ethical responsibility is a sociopathic economic system. In which all manner of goodness, truth, and life itself is sacrificed at the altar of this false god of short-term profit maximization, which serves only a few people. Ladies and gentlemen, what this means is that we have subconsciously reverted to an aristocratic system. We're not even functioning as a democracy right now. You can call it an oligarchy, you can call it a corporatocracy. The point is, it's basically an aristocracy. So the point is, are we going to let that, are we going to let this go in our generation? Are we going to be a generation that says, oh, okay, well, this democracy thing was nice. Are we going to be amused to death? Or are we going to be what Americans are traditionally? There is an audacity to the American Revolution. There was an audacity there. But the American Revolution is an ongoing process. And that's where we were so naive. That we ever thought, okay, it's been established as a democracy, so then we can just take it for granted that this will continue. A democracy does not drive itself. Every generation has to fall in love with this stuff. It's not enough for these principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and equality of all, and the rights that are secured by our Constitution. It's not enough that they're just inscribed on marble walls in Washington, or that they're put on parchment papers behind glass somewhere in Washington. They have to be inscribed in our hearts. And we have to be vigilant. You know, if you don't tend to your marriage, you're going to lose your marriage. If you don't tend to your intimate relationship, you're going to lose it. If you don't tend to your relationship with your children, good luck with that as they grow older. If you don't tend to your body, you're liable to get sick. If you don't tend to your home, if you don't tend to your money, if you don't tend to your career, what do you get to just set up? You know, it's kind of like the plane takes off. At what point do you think the pilot should be able to say, oh, we can just ignore what happened in the cockpit now because we're already in the air? There's no point at which you don't have to stop tending to your democracy. And so one of the principles we have to look at is that we let this happen. All of the challenges to our democracy right now, I see them as opportunistic infections that could not have gotten hold of us the way they have. Had we not too frequently, too many ways, disengaged from the political process. Politics has become a spectator sport. Many of the best and the brightest in America became too cool to care, thought politics was too toxic, left it to other people, figured political people were taking care of this or taking care of that. So there's a change in us that has to happen. We have to take responsibility for the fact, and I think that we are. I do think there's a profound awakening that's been going on for the last 2 years. I don't feel Americans are asleep anymore. I think we're awake, but now we have to harness our awakening. That's number 1. Number 2.